There were 1,000 people in the hall, and I said, my name is Chris Smith. I'm the Labour MP for Islington South and Finsbury, and I'm gay.
A group of us in the Gay Liberation Front hit on the idea of holding a gay pride march to challenge that shameful view.
Equality, and for some people in Stonewall, like me, equality was kind of like what you got to as a starting point.
Welcome to The View From Here, the podcast that explores the lives of key people in the LGBTQ plus movement. I'm Jonathan.
And I'm James. We hope you enjoy the podcast.
Today we're joined for the first of 2 episodes with Peter Tatchell, a lifelong human rights campaigner known for his fearless direct action and global LGBTQ plus advocacy.
In part 1, we hear about his childhood, early activism, and some of the first Pride campaigns in London. With such a unique history and voice, we let Peter introduce himself.
Peter, welcome.
Glad to join you. So my name is Peter Tatchell. I've been campaigning for LGBT plus and other human rights since 1967, when I was aged 15 and still at school. In that time, I've been involved in more than 3,000 direct action protests, many of them involving acts of non-violent civil disobedience, in order to fight for a better world. Also in that time, I've been arrested or detained by the police more than 100 times. Been subjected to over 300 violent assaults, mostly from homophobes and far-right extremists, plus more than 50 attacks upon my home, including 3 arson attacks and even a bullet through my front door. But I'm still here, and I'm still fighting and still determined to help do my bit for a better future.
Wow. And you know, your life story is extraordinary. It's, Jonathan and I were both so grateful for the fight that you've put in that has changed the world and made the world a much better place for LGBT plus people than it was before. And I suppose maybe let's go back to the world before your work and your activism. You were born in Melbourne. And am I right in saying you were an activist from a very young age, even before you came out?
Absolutely. I grew up in the 1960s in Melbourne, Australia. At the time, we'd had 2 decades of unbroken right-wing conservative rule. And on top of that, Australia was fighting alongside the Americans in Vietnam. And there was the draft for that war. And initially, I thought the war was, a just war, to stop communism. But when I delved into it and discovered the horrendous things that Allied troops were doing in Vietnam, the mass indiscriminate bombing of civilian areas, the massacre of villages, the notorious Con Son tiger cages, where any dissident was tortured, often to death. So I became an implacable opponent of the Vietnam War and the draft for that war.
And, that, I guess that I've heard you also activist against the death penalty, supportive Aboriginal rights as well. I mean, it feels like activism is just in your DNA. And is that how it felt growing up, that you saw injustice all around you and you wanted to play a part in addressing that? Yeah,
I mean, I grew up in a very traditional, small C conservative working class family. My father was an engineer, worked in an engineering factory. My family had no interest in the wider outside world. Their focus was on the church and the family.
Right.
They're extremely strict fundamentalist Christians, Pentecostal evangelicals. Right. So I never got any of my activist ideas from them. I just morphed towards that. Probably the biggest influence was the Black Civil Rights Movement in America. Although it was thousands of miles away, it was on the nightly news. Virtually every day, every night, some terrible thing, a lynching of black people, arrest of black people trying to eat at a lunch counter, which was reserved for whites only. But the thing that really struck me, and it's my first, I suppose, perhaps the memory that made me an activist or gravitated me towards activism, was in 1963 when I was 11 years old, I heard about the bombing by white racists of a black church in Birmingham, Alabama, where 4 young girls, about my own age, were murdered. I thought to myself, how could anyone kill another human being, let alone 4 young girls in church on Sunday? And, until that moment, I just noted the news about the black civil rights struggle, but I hadn't really taken a close interest. But that got me interested. I saw this as a just fight. I was white, thousands of miles away, but I understood instantly that was an injustice that had to be fought against. And I suppose it opened my mind to other injustices. So it led me to question Australia's involvement in the Vietnam War, the way in which our own indigenous black Australians, the Aboriginal peoples, were being treated, and the death penalty as well.
Yeah, injustice, as you say, is all around. And how, you said you grew up in a small C conservative Pentecostal Christian household. How did your family react to your activism? And I suppose in 1969 when you came out,
well, they strongly disapproved. Their view was that the role of good Christian is to be godly and pious and obey the 10 Commandments and to shun the world. Not to be involved in the world, to shun it, because the world was not of that wasn't God's intention. God's intention was piety, prayer, salvation. And in terms of my own homosexuality, for my parents, being gay was like the equivalent of being a murderer or a rapist. One of the worst possible sins. So it was very, very tough. But for me, what was surprising is that when I first had sex with a man, when I was 17, I immediately thought, wow, if this is what being gay is, I am definitely gay.
I am here for it.
And, what the Bible says, it's nonsense. I mean, the prescriptions against various sins are supposed to protect people from harm, quite clearly 2 consenting adults and not harming anyone. So that sort of was another factor that impelled me to eventually distance myself from the church and eventually leave it.
Quite a familiar story, I imagine, to quite a lot of people that have been brought up in a very sort of strong, strict religious background.
Yeah, but I didn't feel a moment's guilt. This is the thing. I was curious that I might be gay around the age soon after I was 17, and so I thought, well, the best way to test it out is to try it.
Figure it out.
And that's what I did. But I did not have a moment's guilt. I just thought very rationally and coolly, we're not harming anybody. This has given me incredible physical, sexual pleasure, but also an emotional bond with someone.
Yeah.
How can that be wrong?
And this approach to being so headstrong about creating your own view of what is rational, logical, right, that feels to me something that's very specific to you, that you are a very headstrong person, very clearly, and very forward thinking. Presumably the prevailing narrative in the media and other things at that time was definitely not what you were thinking.
Well, absolutely. I mean, at the time, in the state of Victoria, in Australia, male homosexuality was still a serious criminal offence.
Wow.
You could be jailed for several years, and obviously we would be beaten up in prison as well.
Yeah.
On top of that, you could, in certain circumstances, be compelled to undertake aversion therapy.
Wow.
But this was not like conversion therapy today, which is all words. It was like electric shocks. Strapped in a chair and being given electric shocks to turn you straight.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
You came out in Melbourne. Was there an LGBT movement there that you could identify, that you could take comfort from, activism from, a sense of queer liberation from?
There were no LGBT plus organizations at all in Melbourne at the time. No campaign groups, no helplines, no switchboards, no counselling services, absolutely nothing.
And so where did your ideas of queer liberation come from?
I borrowed them from the Black Civil Rights Movement.
Right.
Because that was I saw a template there of how you do campaigning for social change.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't have any reference point, at all. So I figured out in my own teenage mind, if black people are an oppressed minority who deserve equal civil rights, then the same surely applies to LGBTs.
Mm-hmm.
So I conceived us as an oppressed, victimized minority who had rights and a duty to fight for those rights. And I can remember, at 17, calculating to myself, based on the experience of the Black Civil Rights Movement, that it would probably take about 50 years to win legal equality for LGBTs in Western countries like Australia, United States, and Britain. Now, that was just a guesstimate, but it's more or less turned out to be true.
Yeah, what's happened. Yeah.
But I was in for the long haul. I said, I want to be part. I've been championing black Australians, the people of Vietnam, and so on and so on. Now it's time to put some of my time and effort into fighting for me and my people.
And we'll come on to the Gay Liberation Front, which you were a part of, and its links to the Black Civil Rights Movement. But before we get there, what informed your move to London?
Well, I'd always had a desire to travel. Mm-hmm. Australia's a bit far away. So I was always inquisitive, interested in other cultures and ideas and different places. So I had that intention and desire always to travel. But the main impetus was that I was approaching my 20th birthday when I would have to register for the draft for Vietnam.
Right.
And I thought, I'm not going to fight in that war. That war is profoundly immoral. Around this time, there'd been the My Lai massacre, mm-hmm. where an American company of soldiers had massacred hundreds of Vietnamese women and children. And that was just one of many. That's well known. There are hundreds more that are barely known or have been hidden from history. So I was not going to be part of that. So I was faced with the prospect, either I stay and fight and go to prison for 2 years, which was the penalty for refusing to register, or I go overseas for a while. And of course, I'd only just started this new relationship, where we're deeply in love, and the idea of being separated, would have broken my heart and his. So we came to London in August 1971.
Were quite a lot of people coming at that time? I imagine that a lot of people would have thought to do the same thing.
Yeah, it's hard to know how many.
Yeah.
Quite a lot of people went to other countries. Yeah.
And did you have a sense, from an activist perspective, you had in your mind already that there's a 50-year fight here that to be had? Did you have a sense of, this is fine, I'm going to just take the same flight to the UK? Or did you feel at any point a sort of sense of, were it not for the risk of being drafted to Vietnam, that you actually wanted to stay in Australia and do that fight there?
Yeah, I mean, ideally, I would have liked to have stayed. There was an LGBT group in Sydney,
right,
called Camp, that was quite small, and there's nothing like what we now call a community,
right,
anywhere in Australia. So when I came to Britain, the intention was to stay for maybe 2 or 3 years, when there was expected to be a general election and the Labour opposition was due to win, and they were committed to ending the draft and pulling out of Vietnam. So the intention was, a temporary stay.
Yeah.
But, one thing led to another.
And here you are.
Here I still am.
In the UK. Excellent. And the UK is very grateful.
Very grateful for that. And how did you first explore activism here in the UK?
On the second day I was in London, I was taking a walk around the tourist sites and saw a sticker on a lamppost advertising the meetings of the not long formed Gay Liberation Front. So 5 days later, I was at my first meeting, and within a month, I was helping organize GLF's many spectacular protests.
And for everyone who's listening, really there was also another organization that was active at that time, the Campaign for Homosexual Equality. It had started in the late 1950s as the Northwest Homosexual Law Reform Society, and then morphed into the CHE. Do you feel that there would have been a home for you at the CHE? Because they're very different organizations, the CHE to the GLF.
Yeah, I got total respect for the Campaign for Homosexual Equality and all the predecessor activists and organizations. But they were very much sort of, within the establishment framework. And most people in CHE were still closeted. Mm-hmm. There wasn't the same sense of pride and affirmation and anger that existed in the Gay Liberation Front. And what I liked about the Gay Liberation Front is that it was the first time in British history that tens of thousands of people came out. The first time there were ever any protests for LGBT plus rights. The first time we began to stop apologizing and pleading for our rights and just demanded and asserted them. And also I like the fact that the Gay Liberation Front had an agenda, a wider agenda, an intersectional agenda beyond mere LGBT plus rights. So we supported the Irish freedom movement, the struggles of working class people, women's and black liberation. We saw ourselves as part of a wider, broader movement to transform society. Whereas the Campaign for Homosexual Equality was very much about seeking equality within the status quo, whereas outrage was about tearing up the status quo and creating a new agenda, an equality, but on a new and higher level, and not just to benefit LGBTs, but to benefit all oppressed people.
And your life seemed like it was moving extremely quickly at this point, because you came out in sort of by the end of the 1960s. You moved to London. You joined GLF almost within the same 2 or 3 year period. How did it feel? Your life must have just been going breakneck speed.
Well, it was, and it was very exciting.
I bet it was.
To come to London and to attend those weekly Gay Liberation Front meetings was an incredible personal liberation. Yeah. To be in a meeting room with 200, 300, 400 other people who were champing at the bit to challenge the injustice that LGBTs faced, that was incredibly exciting. And what we were doing was taking on the homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia of centuries.
Yeah.
We weren't merely asking for law reform, which was predominantly the Campaign for Homosexual Equality's agenda. We wanted to challenge the homophobia of the church, the media, the armed forces, the education system. It was, for us, it was
true hearts and mind stuff.
Yeah.
Across the whole society.
Yeah. And it was like to tackle every aspect of discrimination and second-class status that had been thrust upon us. So we had this very simple 3-word slogan, gay is good. Now, that may seem nothing today, but back then, that was a revolutionary idea. Because all throughout history up until then, the prevailing view was that gay was mad, bad, and sad. We were victims. And what GLF did was turn that victimhood on its head. We were no longer victims. We were going to be victors.
Yeah.
We were going to challenge those who put us down. And, we weren't afraid. We weren't afraid of getting arrested. We weren't afraid of, the abuse and threats that followed from far-right extremists or indeed from sections of the media. We were determined to fight for our rights. And that was unprecedented in British history. It had never happened before.
That's amazing.
One of the reasons we really wanted to talk to UK activists is that one of the events that is kind of written large in the history of the LGBT movement is the Stonewall riots in New York. 1969, the year the year you came out. Did that have a real effect for you? Did that reach Australia? Did it reach here? Were people talking about it here when you had moved here?
I never heard about the Stonewall riots when they happened.
Mm-hmm.
The first thing I heard was in the autumn of 1969, probably around September, maybe October. I read a small newsroom brief in one of the Melbourne newspapers, which simply says something like, hundreds or maybe thousands of homosexuals marched through New York last night to demand gay liberation, or maybe gay liberation or equal rights or something. I can't remember exactly. That was my first inkling that other people were campaigning.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought to myself, wow, I want to be part of that. But of course, back then in Melbourne, there was nothing. I remember going to half a dozen of the gay friends that I'd made that year, and suggesting the idea of setting up a gay organization. They all scoffed or either scoffed or looked at me with horror. Go away. You're going to get us all arrested. You're only 17. What do you know? Go away.
And is that very much kind of, because there is definitely a prevailing narrative of, we live in the shadows and we stay in the shadows, and we kind of know our place is in the shadows. We know how that works. We're comfortable here. It's not ideal, but we're comfortable here. Don't upset the status quo or the apple cart.
That was overwhelmingly the predominant view. Yeah.
Mm. Was that?
And there were one or two who were sort of sympathetic, but too scared.
Yeah.
They thought, there would be a policeman's knock on the door.
Yeah.
So all I could do in those circumstances was just wrote letters to the press and challenging homophobia and making the case for decriminalization and so on. But initially, I was too afraid to, sign my name, let alone my address. But over the months, I eventually began giving my name and address. But I was still always nervous and apprehensive that, the newspaper would give the letter to the police and the police would come knocking at the door.
Wow. And that fear of repercussions is something that obviously you have to an extent, but that you really have fought back on, and you are comfortable doing something knowing that it might have terrible repercussions, knowing that you might be arrested or beaten up or worse. And how do you channel that anxiety but still plow on regardless? What drives you on to do that?
People have asked me, what motivates you?
Yeah.
I know it may sound really corny, but I love other people. I love freedom, equality, justice. Those values are really important to me. And I'm not motivated by hate or anger. Although I sometimes do get a bit angry about injustice, but primarily it's about love,
Yeah.
And I want me and others to all be treated with love. And when there's injustice, there's an absence of love. It's the opposite. So that lodestar has sort of been sort of my guiding light for the last, 50, almost 60 years.
And putting your physical security at risk.
Yeah, I'm terrified. Many of those protests, when I tried twice to arrest President Mugabe of Zimbabwe, I was terrified. I was shaking.
Wow.
My stomach was churning over. Because I didn't know how they'd react. And of course, the second time I got beaten unconscious by his bodyguards. And that with other assaults like the ones by neo-Nazis in Moscow in 2007 have left me with cognitive damage and eye damage. But I just think, I can point to all these changes that I and others have helped bring about, which makes life better for LGBTs today. So it's worth it. But it's been tough. I suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. I was attacked in the street just yesterday.
Oh, God.
It's the routine part of my life, but, I am still here, I'm not going to be forced out by bullies, and I've got a very stubborn streak.
Yeah.
I don't want to give homophobes and biphobes and transphobes the satisfaction that they forced me out.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's so inspiring. Because, lots of us see injustice, but don't put themselves on the line. It's truly inspiring, the stories that you share and the life.
Well, each person must do what they feel they can.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I would say that everybody should do something. Maybe not the crazy things that I've done, but do something, even if it's just writing to a member of parliament or, joining a protest or something, it's action equals life, silence equals death. That was the ACT UP slogan.
That's ACT UP.
And it's still relevant today.
And if we go back to the early 1970s in the UK, what were some of the risks that LGBT people faced, both legal and experiential, societal?
Well, of course, there had been a partial decriminalisation of male homosexuality in 1967, but only in England and Wales, not in Scotland until 1980, and not in Northern Ireland until 1982. Not to the armed forces until 1994, and not to the Merchant Navy until 2016.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah, it was a very limited partial decriminalisation. Most aspects of gay male life remained criminalised. And in the years after 1967, in the few years afterwards, arrests and convictions of gay and bisexual men increased by 400%. So decriminalisation, but a huge rocket in arrests and convictions, mostly targeting gay cruising areas, but also clubs and saunas, private birthday parties. The police were absolute monsters. They were out of control. They would abuse you as an effing queer, or bender or faggot or puff or dyke or lessy. There was nothing you could do. And on top of that, they would so often lie in wait outside gay bars and clubs. And as men came out at closing time, they'd sort of order them to move on. And if they didn't promptly move, they'd be pushed and shoved, sometimes arrested. Anybody who challenged them got beaten up. And there was nothing you could do. Nothing you could do.
Were people still being arrested for importuning?
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Can you tell everyone what that is?
Importuning is basically the act of two men eyeing each other up in the street, maybe smiling at each other, and then stopping, talking, and exchanging names and phone numbers. But people were actually arrested and convicted for importuning. These are two men for homosexual importuning on the grounds they merely looked or smiled at each other.
Yes. They might have had sex.
Repeatedly, more than once. And so they didn't have to have sex. That wasn't the criteria.
Because someone the wrong way.
Yeah. And then similarly, the act of procuring a homosexual act, that sort of inviting, encouraging, aiding and abetting, that was still illegal for many years afterwards. So I used to have friends who lived in Manchester, and occasionally I invited them to come and stay in the spare bedroom, but both they and I were committing a criminal offence punishable up to 2 years imprisonment. They were having sex in a house where more than two people were present, and I was allowing them to do this.
And I suppose you were very conscious of how illegal that was and the risk, I suppose, because it wasn't just one of those laws on the statute books that people weren't enforcing. The police were going after it.
Yeah. But it was quite hard for them to catch people. But even so, you always had in the back of your mind, well, this is illegal and the police could barge in and arrest us all. So yeah, there was, obviously, merely kissing, holding hands, or having a cuddle on the street, that could also get you arrested. And, vicious. And then when you're arrested, you often would be abused by the police. They might beat you up in the police station. And it was shocking. It was, people today, it's hard to even imagine how bad it was. But this is not to say that this is the universal experience. Some people had their own, they hid away discreetly and they got away with it and they were never troubled. But if you stuck your neck out or didn't abide by the very strict rules and expectations, then you could be in big trouble. You could lose your job. It was lawful to sack someone from their job because they were gay. It was lawful for a landlord to refuse to rent you premises or to evict you from premises if you were gay, lesbian, bisexual, or trans. There was no kind of legal protection whatsoever against discrimination or harassment.
I went to a house a few years ago in West London, which has 2 front doors. It's one house. It had 2 front doors. And the history of that building was that a gay couple lived side by side and they would only ever go in through their own front door. This was in the 30s and 40s. But they had the kind of walls removed in the middle. So to the outside world, it looked like they were 2 bachelors who were neighbours. And the internal parts of their house had been remodeled so that they could live a life behind those doors. But it was very much behind those doors. And you were one of the organisers heavily involved in the first Pride Parade here in London. Can you tell it? Or we want to hear all about that.
Well, how the idea came about was that the prevailing view of society was that LGBT plus people should be ashamed of who you are. So the opposite to shame is pride. So a group of us in the Gay Liberation Front hit on the idea of holding a gay pride march to affirm who we were, to say we were proud, to challenge that prevailing shameful view. We had no idea who would turn up because back in those days, most LGBT plus people were closeted. They would never show their faces. So it was a huge gamble to hold such a march. But by this time, hundreds of people were attending the weekly Gay Liberation Front meetings. So we assumed, yeah, it will probably work. We may only get a few hundred, but that's a start. From small acorns, great oaks grow.
Yes.
So we began, flyering and leafleting gay venues. I remember about 2 weeks before that first gay pride, which was on the 1st of July, 1972 in London, a group of about 20 of us from the Gay Liberation Front went to what was in the gay ghetto of Earl's Court, where there were two gay pubs and a gay club.
That was one, the Coleherne?
The Boltons, and the Catacombs. And our plan was to drum up support for the Pride March. So we marched with our Gay Liberation Front banner from the tube station down to the pubs. And when we got to the Coleherne, lots of people were standing. It was a summer's day. A lot of people were standing outside drinking. They started to boo and jeer us. And as we tried to walk into the pub, we were elbowed and shoved. It was quite a hostile atmosphere. People were saying, you're extremist. You're going to give us a bad name.
Oh, really? So that's the set of people that were comfortable to say, and just leave this alone. Don't lift up that rock. You know what's underneath it.
I remember one guy said, we should keep our heads down. To which I replied, if you keep your head down, you get your head kicked in. We have to stand up, stick up for ourselves. We got into the pub, but we had some sympathetic responses, but mostly it was like, get out of here. I'm cruising, I've come here for a drink. And eventually we were ejected.
Wow.
By a combination of the bar staff and some of the gay men in the pub. So that's what we were up against. There was a whole strata of LGBT plus society that had internalized the homophobia. They thought they weren't equal. They thought they deserved to be treated as second class because in their minds they were. They were flawed, imperfect, abnormal, unnatural, everything that straight society put on us. A lot of people in our community believed it.
Interesting. Which is still a problem. to some extent, people still feel gay shame in some sense, I think. Still have to come out every time you meet a new set of people or start a new job or whatever else. There's still a lot of different processes that you have to go to. I think there is still a lot of that. We've come a huge distance. Yeah. To your point, acorns turn into mighty oaks. That's definitely where we're at. But there's still more to do.
Yeah, I mean, that first march, there's probably about 700 people.
Oh, wow.
We assembled in Trafalgar Square and then marched via Charing Cross Road and Oxford Street to Hyde Park. What was extraordinary to me was the vast number of police. There was virtually a police officer for every marcher.
Wow.
And lots on the sides, side streets and trailing behind in vans and so on. You definitely got the feeling that they regarded us as criminals. Yeah. As dangerous people who had to be watched. And there may have been one or two exceptions, but the body language and the way the police spoke was aggressive, hostile, unsympathetic.
And that wouldn't have just been the police doing that themselves. That would have been an instruction from government as well. So the government was presumably part of the set of, the thought of what you were doing as hostile.
Yeah, I mean, I can't say whether they got instructions from up on high in the government, but their demeanour reflected the demeanour of the government, of the day. Led by a closeted gay man, Edward Heath, but one who prevailed over homophobic society and did nothing to change the laws. The most memorable incident on that march was we were going up Oxford Street and I was carrying a small sign, gay is good. And off on the pavement was a very elderly, wizened old woman in twin set and pearls, laden with shopping. And she was on the edge of the pavement and she peered over as I came up and said, "Oh, what's gay?" And I said, "Oh, gay means homosexual." And she shrugged her shoulders and said, oh, good luck.
Good luck.
And things like that gave us hope that things could change. Yeah. But overall, I'd say on the march, about a third of the public were hostile, shouting abuse, sometimes throwing things at us.
Wow. And is that gathered specifically to protest?
No,
just people that happen to be there, passers-by.
Just happened to be there on the pavement. Yeah. Then another third were just, I suppose, confused, bewildered, disbelieving that gay people would dare show their faces in public. And just like these strange sort of open-mouthed stares. But then I'd say overall, probably about a third of the people were actually supportive. People gave thumbs up.
Great.
Clapped, said good on you,
Wow.
That gave us hope. When we got to Hyde Park, of course there was no corporate sponsorship or anything like that. It was DIY party games, so people bought food and drink and often alcohol and dope. So we had a big what we called a gay day, which was basically open air picnic in Hyde Park. Playing party games and like spin the bottle and And what was interesting, the police lined up on the side of the park, going down Park Lane, quite a distance away. There's probably about well over 100 of them, maybe a bit more, but they were all like, their body language, folded arms, scowling faces. I mean, under normal circumstances, if it was just 2 or 3 of us, they would have arrested us.
Yeah.
But because there were so many, I presume, they didn't dare. So we got away with it. And that taught us a lesson, safety in numbers.
Yeah.
And don't think the police, cannot be stopped or cannot be outfoxed.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, as the crowds are dispersing from Hyde Park, did you have a moment to think, oh God, we did this?
Yeah, I think, even halfway through, we thought wow, this is success.
Yeah.
It's not thousands, it's only 700, but this is success. This is a start. And even before we got to Hyde Park, I think we were all thinking, we're going to do this again next year.
Yeah.
It was already a fixture of the calendar from then on.
Yeah.
Did you at a time think about what it would turn into today? Was that, did you dare to dream that big, or we could talk about whether it's good or bad, but the size of it?
No, we had no idea it would ever get as big as it has. We thought it would grow. And as I said, the plan was to do it next year and by implication the year after. As far as I know, that Gay Pride March in London was the first in the world to call itself Gay Pride.
I was going to ask you that, because it was Christopher Street Liberation Day Parade in the US the following year.
Yeah.
So that's in
the preceding year.
The preceding year, yes.
Yeah. And somehow, in some cities it was called Queer Liberation Day or Gay Liberation Day. But I think we were the first to actually call it Gay Pride,
Fantastic.
And we call it Gay Pride, not LGBT plus Pride or not just Pride,
Yeah.
Because back in those days, gay was encompassing.
Yeah. The other famous GLF protest was against the Festival of Light. And I would love to hear a little bit about what that was, your involvement in it. I know that it was quite a long, really well-planned protest and campaign that involved infiltration and a whole range of things. So we would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so in 1971, the Festival of Light was set up by morality campaigner Mary Whitehouse with the support of, well-known Christians like Malcolm Muggeridge, Cliff Richard, Bishop Trevor Huddleston, and others. Its agenda was primarily to recriminalize pornography, abortion, and homosexuality. So they were against what they called the permissive society. And their goal was to roll back the reforms of the 1960s. So LGBT were very much in their sights. We in the Gay Liberation Front hit on the idea of doing a counter-protest at their main launch event at Central Hall, Westminster, right opposite Parliament and Westminster Abbey. So we codenamed it Operation Rupert, after the cartoon character Rupert Bear in the satirical underground magazine Oz. And we bought a handful of genuine tickets and then forged hundreds of others using their template. And the idea was to infiltrate 100 plus people into the meeting and then to do a series of protests during the course of the meeting. So disruption and spoiling the launch was the main focus. This involved various subgroups. I was with the youth group. I was only, 20, I was not 19 at the time. I was with the youth group. And so at a certain point during proceedings, the youth group we weren't the entire youth group, but those of us who were there were probably about 10 of us, stood up and same-sex kissed in the balcony. And then that created mayhem. And then a little bit later, somebody further up in the balcony, in another section, unfurled a big banner saying "Cliff for Queen," having a go at Cliff Richard. Then down below, a group of gay men in nun drag started doing the can down the aisles.
Amazing.
Then later on, there's another group released mice into the audience, and people started screaming and running. So it was all round mayhem.
Were you thrown out after your stunt, your part of the scene? Did you get kicked out by security, or did you manage to stay?
They tried to, but at a certain point we felt we made our point, so we left voluntarily.
Oh, fine, right.
But there were too many different groups all around.
They couldn't tell who was actually genuinely there for the event and who was there to disrupt it.
Yeah.
And I think I told you this on the phone, but I was at Central Hall a few months ago at the Off West End Awards, and it was hosted by a drag queen. And I thought, oh my gosh, how far this building has come.
Absolutely.
What? I'm just so curious about this day, and I think this day of protest in Central Hall just sounds so amazing. What happened afterwards? Presumably, you all had a kind of rendezvous point outside the building. You knew that you were all going to get kicked out eventually. What was there an air of jubilation after?
Oh yes. Oh yeah. We felt that we'd rained on their parade.
Yeah.
And we would have loved to have had a proper dialogue, and we did have dialogue with some of the people who came out.
Okay.
Afterwards, but most of them are pretty fanatical,
Oh, really?
And yeah, it was hard to have dialogue, but we did talk to some of the people. Quite a few of us stayed outside,
right,
as the crowds came out, and engaged with people, and we got quite a lot of hostility, but there were some people who did engage and feigned some sympathy for your plight.
You poor sick sinners.
Yeah,
we have sympathy for you.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. And the GLF burned really brightly, but not for a very long time. Can you tell us about how it disbanded?
Well, like any radical movement where there's no money, no funds, no office, no staff support, it's sustained by volunteers. And that's great so long as volunteers are around, but if volunteers have to move to a different part of the country because of their job or partner or whatever, there are lots of different things that make movements quite, unstable. I think for the Gay Liberation Front, one of the mistaken decisions, in my view, was to devolve to groups that are locally based. So there was a South London GLF, a West London GLF, an East London GLF, a North London GLF. So that diffused the critical mass that we had at the weekly meetings in Notting Hill Gate. That diffused them to these 4 other centres. And in the process, the energy, was lost, I think. And it meant that each of these groups had to do off their own bat what we collectively were all doing as one, which was much, much easier.
Mm-hmm.
Plus, there was quite a big issue over lesbians leaving GLF, feeling that some of the gay men were misogynist and sexist and were not addressing women's issues.
Was there some truth in that?
Yes, yeah. I mean, it's not, I don't think any of the men in GLF were overtly or deliberately misogynist, but they just had a mindset that, law reform or some other gay male issue was more important. And in terms of numbers, the meetings were overwhelmingly male.
Right.
Not that women were excluded,
no,
but women felt in a minority.
Mm-hmm.
And this was the time of the big explosion of the women's liberation movement. And a lot of lesbians, I think, understandably felt, well, let's work through the women's liberation movement.
Is it something you regret, perhaps, that there weren't more women involved, or that you and others didn't do more to try to get more women to participate, and that led maybe to some of the challenges at the end? Or are you, is it that's just the way it went and it would have been hard to do things differently?
Yeah, I think in that era, or even today, it is a fact that most organizations tend to be male dominated, even if they don't intend to be. So that's a real problem for women, and I think GLF suffered from that. And yeah, I wish we'd done more. And there was a group of women who stayed within GLF who didn't agree with the more separatist approach, and they continued and stayed on and worked within GLF. And I think they played a very important role. There weren't very many of them, but they played a very important role.
And activism continued throughout the 1970s and into the 1980s, and then the HIV epidemic came along. Do you feel that the HIV epidemic changed the nature of activism in the queer communities?
Oh, absolutely. What happened was a lot of people shifted out of LGBT plus activism into AIDS activism or treatment support research groups. So you had a whole cadre of seasoned, very effective LGBT plus campaigners who dropped that baton and took up the baton of fighting HIV and AIDS. And that was necessary, but it left the wider movement severely depleted and diminished. So I would say that the focus of the LGBT plus community in terms of campaigning shifted dramatically from LGBT plus issues into HIV and AIDS.
And can you tell us a bit about your own AIDS activism with the UK AIDS Vigil organisation?
Yeah, I mean, I did a lot of freelance ad hoc HIV AIDS campaigning from the early 1980s, getting together like-minded groups of people to do specific actions around demanding better government funding for the Terence Higgins Trust. You know, by the mid-1980s, the Terence Higgins Trust had received, I think, only one grant of £35,000 from the Thatcher government.
Wow.
And it was the lead organisation for HIV education, prevention, treatment, care and support. 35,000. So insulting. So typical of the Thatcher government's disregard and disrespect for our community. So, so those are some of the issues we campaigned on. Then in the late 80s, 1987, I heard that the British government was planning to host a World Health Ministers Summit on AIDS in London in January 1988. So this was about a year beforehand. So together with Phil Cox, who was HIV positive and involved in HIV campaigning, we set up the UK AIDS Vigil organisation. And our remit was to put human rights front and centre. At that stage, the human rights of people living with HIV and AIDS was just not on the agenda, not an issue. So we wanted to make it an issue. So between the two of us, we drafted what turned out to be the world's first ever HIV/AIDS Human Rights Charter, setting out how governments, organizations, and individuals should treat people living with HIV and AIDS. And then we organized, on the eve of the World Health Ministers Summit, a huge candlelit march from Hyde Park to the Queen Elizabeth II Conference Centre, where the health ministers were going to be meeting. It was just so magnificent. The whole of Whitehall, from Trafalgar Square to Parliament Square, was just a sea of candles. Wow. An extraordinarily beautiful sight. And then we rallied and had speeches outside the QE2 Centre, calling on the health ministers to put combating discrimination on the agenda. It wasn't on the agenda. We said this has got to be on the agenda. And then on the opening day of the conference, we held a parallel AIDS and Human Rights conference right next door in Central Hall, Westminster.
Oh, wow.
Where Derek Jarman came out as being HIV positive, and many people from organizations like Body Positive, Frontliners, Terence Higgins Trust, London Lighthouse and others spoke. So we really set the agenda through the march and the conference that there had to be the issue of human rights addressed. We weren't convinced we made it. So what I did was the left-wing Labour newspaper Tribune gave me a journalist pass. So on the closing day of the conference, I went as a journalist, and then midway in the afternoon, got up on my seat, strode to the front, and demanded that they issue a statement opposing discrimination. And so I was just saying that, one of the unintended consequences of HIV and AIDS was a huge increase in prejudice, ostracism, discrimination and hate crime. And we have to address that. You cannot fight this virus by demonizing people. And there were calls in those days, even by politicians in this country, to round up all gay people or all people with HIV and put them in quarantine camps.
Yeah.
So that made quite a bit of an impact. But they gave me probably 3 or 4 minutes to speak.
Oh, wow.
But the upshot was, at the end, they did issue a statement condemning discrimination, saying that, people with HIV must be treated with respect and the focus must be on education and support.
Wow.
So that was, I know it was just words, but at least it was there.
Yeah.
And it gave activists all over the world a template, a reference point, a document they could cite in support of their own work.
Yeah. Yeah. The starting point.
And that was the whole idea, was to get that World Health Ministers Conference to make a statement like that, so it could be used by activists all over the world to hold their governments to account. Yeah. You were there, you were at this conference, you signed the declaration, it's got this clause about anti-discrimination, we expect you to honour it.
Amazing.
That was incredibly useful. Didn't always work,
no,
of course, but it gave a huge, it gave something that could be cited and used by activists.
Yeah. That kind of almost global recognition.
Yeah.
This is part of what we're trying to do.
Yeah.
So powerful. And so extraordinary to have, but again, just like how brave you were, just to brazenly charge up to the lectern and just say, guys, this is what I want you to do. And like, I'm in so much awe that every opportunity you've had to jump in, to do something, to go the extra mile, you've taken it.
I don't think it was brave, but I was incredibly nervous. With all these things, nerves is partly about, will I be stopped before I get to do it?
Yeah.
Will security grab me and the whole plan will go to pieces? Or will I express what needs to be expressed adequately? Will I say what needs to be said? And then again, will it have any impact?
Yeah.
Thank you for listening to The View from Here. Of course, there's a lot of politics in any movement, but the political views you've heard across the series don't necessarily reflect the views of the podcast.
If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing and leaving a review, as well as sharing the word on social media. Join us next time for more personal stories from the front lines of LGBTQ+ history.